All right, so we're recording. Welcome to the Becoming Conscious podcast. I'm excited to have you on and talk about some deep topics today.
Yeah, excited to be here. Definitely always love talking about this stuff.
Awesome. So I think we can just start out. If you want to explain who you are, what you do on your YouTube channel, what you talk about, and then, we'll go from there.
So my name's Ethan Kahn, spelled Kahn. A lot of people think Khan like Genghis Khan, but I've had a YouTube channel for about 4 years now, kind of seriously uploading for the past 3. And I delved through a lot of different spiritual and philosophical and religious topics over on my channel. Anything from non-duality to zodiac signs to materialism, quantum physics, the nature of infinity, the nature of consciousness, etc. I just explore a plethora and wide variety of topics.
Awesome. So to just get a little bit into your background, so like what kind of made you curious about these topics in the first place, or like what brought you down this path, and how are you embodying that curiosity today, or like just kind of elaborate a little bit on that? That would be sweet.
Yeah, so what's a little bit strange about me is just that I've always been immersed in this infinite state that I describe on a couple videos over on my channel. I've always been experiencing that throughout my entire life. So I was never really set on a particular spiritual path, but you could say what sparked my curiosity in spirituality was, as I got older and learned how to speak and learned how to articulate the nature of this experience to my parents and my friends, I started to notice, and they started to notice, that a lot of the things I would talk about that pertain to this state matched a lot of concepts that you would find in various types of spirituality, whether it be non-duality or more new age topics, and not just spirituality, but even like mathematics. Like I would always tell my parents about like all the dimensions that existed. They're like, oh, well, you should maybe go into physics later on, or be a mathematician, or be a philosopher. So it actually not only sparked my interest in spiritual paths, or I should say spiritual fields, since I didn't go down a particular path, but it also sparked my interest in mathematics, physics, philosophy, religion. I definitely liked to comparatively study various different religions and their belief systems and see where they lined up with what I was experiencing. So it definitely sparked a curiosity across kind of a bunch of different fields, almost like a universal curiosity more than just a spiritual one.
Awesome. So you would say, like, I was gonna ask you if there was like any like religion in particular, or like any framework in particular that like you kind of found, you're like, yes, that matches my experience, or you kind of just like started to notice that a lot of these different frameworks like Buddhism, Hinduism, non-duality, physics, you kind of just noticed that a lot of these things matched up, and it wasn't any one in particular, but just like a bunch of different ones where you just pick from each different one, and you're
Mhm.
like, these certain things and these different ideas match kind of what I'm experiencing, and that this on the
Yeah.
spiritual level.
Yeah. So what I definitely noticed is that each field, and then with religion and each belief system or each denomination of each religion, they each had like an atom of truth. And that doesn't mean like they had like only a small amount of truth. Like, oh, Christianity is only like a little bit right. No, it doesn't mean that. Like, even if these fields have a lot of truth in them, the massive amount of truth that they have still only makes up like a small part of, you could say, like the whole truth or the ultimate truth or whatever you want to call it. So it was almost like having all these different puzzle pieces and seeing where they fit, like seeing how mathematics represents reality and how each religious belief system depicts a different uh, belief, or I'm sorry, different like creation story or different being that actually exists in reality, or a different concept. So they all just had their own pieces of the truth that fit together very elegantly, I noticed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a really valuable way to look at it too, because like a lot of most people go at like different religions or different ideas from like, all right, I need to find one and this one is going to be correct. And then I'm going to look at the
Yeah.
world from this one viewpoint. And it's like,
Mm,
I think that a lot of people are starting to move into the idea that like, all right, we can take different valuable insights from all these different
mhm. Yeah,
religions and whatever. And like, that's kind of the more
yeah,
holistic, like integral way of looking at it, So
yeah. Mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, for sure. It seems like in this day and age, a lot of people are transitioning to that type of thinking, that more holistic thinking. You could say like stage yellow or stage turquoise. Um, but how I always thought of it too is that looking for a religion is almost like shopping at a store. Like different people have different wants and different needs. And so you go to a store and buy whatever's going to serve your wants and needs. And that's kind of what religion is like. You can actually shop around for different belief systems and different perspectives of reality. I don't like to necessarily call them belief systems since they do have truth in them. I like to call them perspectives or different types of experiences, but you can shop around for your own perspective and experience of reality that serves you the best. So maybe being in touch with Hindu deities, maybe each of those Hindu deities has something that could serve you in some way, mentally or physically or emotionally. And so you kind of shop around and you pick out Hinduism, you adopt that perspective, uh, and take that on as your experience of reality. So that's kind of the way I think about it too, with like the more partisan people who don't necessarily have a holistic view where they balance it all out. They're kind of just picking out their one item that's going to serve them for the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that like when you're talking about that, it kind of made me think of like a lot of people that are moving into like stage yellow, stage turquoise, like second tier thinking. It's like people are becoming more able to shop around and pick like ideas, but
Yeah.
also on top of that, that's like one side of things. But like the other side
Mhm.
of things is like, but also not identify with them, and like
Yeah.
they can still remain in that detached perspective of like, all right, this is a perspective. And they kind of, it's like knowing that it is a perspective. So it's like, all right,
Yeah.
I resonate with this one the most, but I still understand that it's a perspective and it's not like I can still be open to every other perspective.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there was an old quote, I don't remember who it was from, but they said that a stage yellow thinker can entertain an idea without adopting it. They are very flexible like that. They can more easily move from one perspective to another. That's definitely their strength. And then turquoise is even more flexible. They don't even really need to like shift from one to the other like yellow does. They can kind of just hold them all at once, which yeah, that's I think I've always thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what one idea that I found really interesting is like, so Ken Wilber talks about the idea that like once 10% of a population gets to a stage, then that's when it starts to permeate the culture. And he's saying
Mhm,
that right now we're seeing about 10% at stage yellow. So
mhm,
hopefully we'll start seeing these ideas of being able
mhm,
to look at multiple different perspectives and not thinking that my perspective is the only right perspective. We'll start to see that go into the culture. And so I think um, I'm really trying to, I'm really thinking about this a lot lately of like, there's so much division in the US,
mhm.
politics, religious, there's certain people saying that we might have a civil war in the future because if this keeps going
Mhm.
on like this forever, like this is not going to be good.
Yeah.
But from my
Mhm,
viewpoint, I'm like, all right, well, if a lot of people are moving into this stage yellow approach, we're going to have more people that are able to integrate all the different stages, all the different belief
mhm,
systems. And I see that as a positive thing. Like, I don't know how you
mhm.
view it, but like, I see that as like, oh, we're only going to get better from here on out.
Yeah, it definitely could spur more peace in the world. And I mean, I have noticed that all the top intellectuals in universities are starting to become more yellow. Like, I actually did have a couple of my professors who I would say were stage yellow. One of my favorite philosophy professors at my university was yellow. A couple others kind of seemed to be transitioning into it. And I mean, I go to the University of Oklahoma, where I went there. I just graduated. But this is a very conservative state. So if, you know, the top professors here in a very conservative state are more stage yellow, then I would say definitely at even bigger universities, that's probably even more the case. So I would probably agree that about 10% of the population now is at yellow. I think that sounds about right.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so yeah, to kind of switch the topics a little bit
Mhm.
because I'm not sure where to go with that one anymore.
Yeah, we definitely don't have to talk about spiral dynamics the whole time.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, so like this whole channel, this whole podcast is about like becoming conscious and like
Yeah.
I've framed like I've thought about this, like what does it mean to become conscious? And I don't think like I'm starting to get a better understanding of what it means as I go further down on the path, but I think you could elaborate and provide a lot of insights on this topic. So like
Mhm.
in your experience, in your like what does it mean to be higher conscious? What's the difference between like people's ideas of like, oh, I'm going to become enlightened, I'm going to become higher conscious, this is what's going to happen, it's going to solve all my problems, like what's the reality of it? And then on the other side, like what's a lot of the things that people don't realize happens that are like good or like that are like super valuable and that really shift and change in your perspective, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that people mix up with a lot of other areas. So we have, you know, quite a few metrics. We have higher strength, higher power, higher intelligence. Higher consciousness is actually its own metric. Being higher conscious is different from all the other metrics. It's not going to necessarily mean that you're higher strength or that you're higher power or even that you have higher intelligence. A lot of people really tie those two together. A lot of people think that being higher conscious makes you smarter. That's actually not necessarily the case. Intelligence is not on the same metric as consciousness. Now, of course, it is within consciousness, as we'll probably talk about later here in this podcast. Everything is contained within consciousness because everything is contained within experience. But intelligence is still not consciousness itself, even if it's held within your consciousness. So being higher conscious, all that means is that you have higher awareness. I use those terms interchangeably. Consciousness equals awareness. So being higher conscious just means you have higher awareness. And higher awareness means you're more aware of your environment, you're more aware of your emotions, your thoughts, the nature of yourself, how the self relates to the environment. This is why a lot of people who are higher conscious get into non-duality, because they start to see how the self relates to the environment in that it's not really distinct from it. It's all one with it together in this one experience that you're having. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you're smarter. Like being a
Yeah.
non-dualist doesn't make you smarter. You don't know about like atoms. You don't know what atoms are necessarily. You don't know how your neurons work. So you don't necessarily know more. You're just aware of more. You see how everything relates to everything else. And then another metric that people kind of confuse high consciousness with is being more powerful. People think, okay, so if I pursue enlightenment and consciousness work and I raise my consciousness to these super high levels, I'm gonna develop like superpowers. I'm gonna be able to heal people. I'm gonna be able to remote view. Um, I'm gonna be able to levitate and stuff like that. Now, those abilities are real. I know I don't have evidence for them right now, but in my infinite experience of reality, I see that those types of abilities really do exist. However, being higher conscious does not automatically mean that you're going to develop those sorts of super abilities. Um, there's, for example, in reality, there's infinitely many beings. There's some beings that are very low conscious, but they're like super powerful. Like they can, I mean, healing, levitating, all of that is child's play to them. And yet they're lower conscious than a lot of human children. So the two don't necessarily support each other, and vice versa. You can be very high conscious and not only have no like super abilities, but even be like disabled from a human perspective. I mean, look at how many gurus we've had who are just these very frail older people who can't
Yeah.
even like stand up out of a wheelchair, right? Like, why weren't they able to heal themselves? It doesn't mean that they're low conscious. uh they're higher conscious, they're more aware of the nature of the self, the nature of the environment, but they haven't necessarily developed more power. So it is definitely its own metric that should be looked at distinctly from all the others. It doesn't mean that you're going to be more powerful because that's its own metric. It doesn't mean you're going to be smarter or know more, because higher intelligence is its own metric. So it definitely needs to be looked at separately and independently from those, I think.
Yeah. No, I like that explanation, and like especially relating to that spiritual intelligence versus
Mhm.
um not spiritual, of like having higher intelligence versus being higher conscious. I find a lot of people go like I think I heard it from like Sam Harris, or like
Mhm.
a lot of different people will look at Eastern religions and they'll be like, all right, well, if the Buddha was all knowing and all in like if like all these things that we attribute to like enlightenment, they're like, well, how did they not know what an atom was, or how did they not know
Yeah,
all these like new age, new modern scientific ideas? And like,
yeah,
there's a difference there. Like being higher conscious, you can have
yeah.
experiences, right, of like you call it like absolute infinity, or of like um where like your ego dies, or like I don't know, however you
Mhm.
want to explain these experiences. People will often take that language however you're describing it, and they'll be like, oh, so you mean that people could understand what an atom was and what
Mhm.
a black
Yeah.
hole was, all like all
Mhm.
these, and like no,
Yeah.
those are making that distinction is key.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, think like even if the Buddha was aware of atoms, like think if he was so high conscious where he was actually like experiencing atoms, even then, being aware that atoms are there still doesn't mean that you know what they are. So it's like even if he was in touch with that, even if he was aware that those tiny little objects that we call atoms now were there, it still doesn't mean that he knows what they are. So even then, it still doesn't lead to more intelligence about them.
Yeah, 100%. And then you started to touch on this too. So like intelligence, power, all these things, these are housed within our conscious experience. So
Mm-hmm.
like I've been doing a lot of like contemplation on like the nature of self, the who am I type contemplation. And like I've started to see a shift lately where like before I would try to do like a contemplation where like I would ask like who am I? But I'd be in my conceptual mind. I would have no frame of reference for what it means to not be in my conceptual mind, right? So I'd be
Mm-hmm.
like, who am I? Who am I? Like, oh, I could be this, I could be that. And then like recently it's like, oh, I'm just like something that's experiencing all these thoughts, all these things. And
Yeah.
like I haven't really fully grasped it, but it's kind of been a shift of like, all right, I'm instead of looking into like new thoughts, I'm just gonna look into different like ways of experience, or like you like different ways of framing my experience, and like sitting in that state of
Mm-hmm.
like not knowing. So I think that's
Yeah.
kind of like how when I hear you explain consciousness, that's kind of how I frame like this experience of like trying to understand who am I. Like Ramana
Mm-hmm.
Maharshi, his entire thing to reach enlightenment, just ask who am I. It's like the Advaita Vedanta. It's Yana yoga. Like different Eastern schools talk about this. How can you like elaborate on how you would define consciousness as like it is that which is aware of everything in our experience, so therefore it can't be an object. So anything that we look at, anything that we perceive or experience, this is not what consciousness really is. And like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, a little thought experiment that I like to have people do when they ask this question is, think if you weren't conscious at all. And now remember, I use the terms conscious and aware interchangeably. So think if you had no awareness at all. You know, the room you're in wouldn't be here. Your body wouldn't be here. People would think, okay, so I'd be in a dark void. Well, no, you're still aware, even if you're in a void. Like this emptiness or this sunyata, as the Buddhists call it, those are still states of awareness. Like you're still there, you're still aware that you're there. So think even if that was gone, you didn't even have voids, you didn't even have emptiness. There's literally nothing, not even emptiness. Nothing would be there at all. Nothing would exist, not even the phenomenon of emptiness. So with this, you realize that experience is basically kind of inseparable from reality. You don't have reality. You don't have anything there if you don't have experience, and you don't have experience without awareness. So it's like awareness equals experience equals reality. If you get rid of any of those, you get rid of the other two automatically. So consciousness is the experience itself. Awareness is the experience itself, because without that awareness, there would be no experience. So the two are inseparable. The two are the same. So consciousness is not something within experience. You know, a lot of people think that consciousness is like something in the brain. It's something that neurons generate, but it's not, because if it was, that would be something within experience. But it is the experience itself. And if it's the experience itself, then it can't be any particular object within the experience. It technically would be every single object within your experience, rather than just another object to be added to it. If that's a little confusing, something that I always say is that if you have like a set, and then within that set you have like all these different items, consciousness is not just another item in the set, it is the set itself. It's all of the items and the encompassing set itself. So it's not just a particular item in the set, it's not just a particular thing or object within experience. And so a lot of people, a lot of spiritual teachers will say, okay, well, that means it's nothing. If it's not any particular thing in reality or in experience, then it's nothing. But no, that's that's not necessarily it either, because it's here. Like you're aware right now, it's obvious that consciousness exists. So it's not nothing, but at the same time, it's not a thing within the experience. So what I like to say is that it's neither a thing nor is it nothing. It's actually thingness itself. And by thingness itself, I mean the essence of experience. When you have an experience, you're experiencing things. So you could say experience itself is like thingness itself. You can't have an experience without things. So consciousness is that very essence, that very fabric of thingness. It's not a particular thing, it's the essence itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that it makes a lot of sense, and like it's starting to make more sense on a conceptual level, definitely. And like I'm
Mhm,
starting to understand, like, all right, like this is why consciousness can't be in the brain. This is like
mhm,
all this type of stuff. One thing is like how I don't know if you have any like good explanation for this, but like I feel like a common question along this path would be like, all right, if consciousness is thingness itself, if it's like the essence of everything around us, because if it was something that we could experience, then who is experiencing that object?
yeah,
And so it's like
mhm,
that's kind of like it's a logical thought process. It's like, all right, I understand that idea,
mhm,
but it feels so real that I'm perceiving from somewhere inside my head. Like I can't, it's so hard to get over that idea, right? Because like,
yeah,
all right, well, is it possible to not be this human body if I'm
mhm,
experiencing life through this human body? Like, how do
mhm,
we get over that idea and like break through into like who we actually are?
mhm. So basically, you can have the experience of being within the human body, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the human body is all you are. or all you're experiencing. I mean, for example, like if you look around at like the room you're in and the objects you're perceiving, I mean, this is all just a rendered image in your mind. Like your mind is rendering this whole thing. Whether or not it's rendering these images based off like sensory input, that's not necessarily a part of the question. Because even if there are objects outside of your perception that these renderings are representing, what you're seeing is still not them. So it's still the case that everything you're seeing, everything you're hearing is a rendering in your own mind. So even if you're having an experience of it all being out here, that whole entire experience of it being out there is still in here. It's still in the mind. And that sounds like a paradox, but it's not necessarily a paradox. It's just, you could say like the experience of something being outside of you is a rendering inside of you, which sounds very strange, but that's really the nature of it. Like, so it's not that the self equals the body, it's more like the self equals the experience, because everything you experience is rendered in the mind, it's rendered in the self, and you never experience anything outside of your own experience. This is an infallible truth. Nobody ever experiences anything outside of their own experience. Even if you have like a mystical experience of astral projecting outside of your body, that's still not going outside of your experience. People will say, well, Ethan, I astral projected outside my body. That means I went outside myself. I went outside my experience. I say, no, you didn't. That was still an experience that you were having. So even if you go outside of your body, you're still not going outside of your experience. So therefore, you're still not going outside of your awareness. Therefore, you're still not going outside of yourself. So outside of the body is still inside of the self, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, so I think it'd be like a lot of us live under the assumption that like my body equals my experience, but like I'm experiencing my body, but there's also much more to my experience. And if the
Yeah,
like who we really are is our experience, then it includes the body and whatever we're experiencing
yeah,
as like whatever in the body, but it also includes everything else. So like I guess one thing that like when these non-dual teachers talk about like infinite experience or like becoming one with everything, or it's like
mm,
it it sounds to me like they're what I'm misunderstanding is like it's not that like I understand everything that there is to know in the world. It's not like I understand what like it's not like I can see like so there's like a house in front of me. It's not like I can see on the other side of that house. It's just whatever I'm experiencing right now, what that
mhm.
I deem as outside myself, that actually is myself. And it's not like I can see something beyond my experience. It's just this entire experience is all who I really am. Is that like a correct way to frame it or what?
Yeah, exactly. Everything that you're experiencing of the house is a part of you. So if I say to somebody, okay, that house is a part of you because you're experiencing it and your experience is yourself, and they ask me, okay, well, then tell me what the family is doing in the house right now. You should be able to see what they're doing inside of the house. Well, no, that's not the case because you're not experiencing the inside of the house. You're experiencing the outside of the house. So it's the part of the house that you're experiencing. That's the part that's a part of you because that's what you're experiencing. It's what's a part of your experience that's a part of you, if that makes sense. So if you like look at a wall in your room right now, you're not experiencing the outside of that wall. You're only experiencing the inside of it. So the inside of that wall, if that's a part of your experience right now, then it's a part of your awareness. And if it's a part of your awareness, then it's a part of yourself. The outside of the wall, you're not even experiencing that right now. So that's not a part of your awareness. That's not part of yourself. Therefore, uh, it's it's a pointless objection to say that you should know what the other side of the wall is like, because that's not even a part of it right now. You're not experiencing it right now.
So like getting when all these spiritual perspectives talk about getting rid of the ego, or like getting past the illusion of the self, it's like the illusion of the self being, it's actually like identifying with our body rather than with our awareness or with experience, and it's kind of getting rid of the body identification and kind of growing into, or starting to shift to an experience of like, all right, whatever I'm actually experiencing, this is who I am, not just this human body
Mm.
type of
Yeah,
thing.
you could say it's taking on a more holistic perspective of your experience. So rather than you perceiving yourself as separate from your surrounding environment, you see how your surrounding environment is just as much a part of your experience as your internal environment or as your body is. Like you're experiencing your surrounding environment just as much as you're experiencing your own thoughts. Like think about that for a second. You're not experiencing one more than the other. The room around you is just as vivid as your thoughts. So you're experiencing both equally. So if you're experiencing both equally, why should you consider what's in here to be a part of the self, but not what's out here? They're both being equally experienced by the self. Therefore, they're both equally a part of that self. And so you kind of integrate the two. There is no more subject object distinction. That distinction collapses. You become one with your surrounding environment. There's no more self and other. There's just the holistic self, the non-dual self. That's one with the entire experience.
And so like seeing the non-dual self, it's like, all right, subject object collapse. It's like, all right, I don't see the distinction between objects. How does that like translate into like, all right, well, I see there's a computer, a table, then a floor, then like a curtain, and then like a window. Like I still see the distinction between all those different objects. When
Yeah.
you're in a state of oneness, you still see like that distinction. You just define, you see yourself as those things. Is that kind of a way to frame it? Or like,
Yeah. It's almost like the analogy I like to use a lot is drops of water in an ocean. So you can still see that an ocean has separate, distinct drops of water, but you see how they're all one. They're different drops, but they're the same ocean. So the computer, your shoes, your bed, those are different objects, but they're all the same consciousness. They're all the same experience. So it's almost kind of hierarchical if you think about it. Like you can have distinct atoms within an object, but they're all a part of the same object. It's the same thing with these objects of experience. Yes, they're distinct objects, but they're all one in that they're all a part of the same experience. They're all a part of your consciousness and your awareness.
yeah, it's like how atoms make up a molecule, molecules make up cells. It's like these objects make up consciousness. They're like,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
sweet.
that's the thing. That's why a lot of mystical teachers, like not just in modern times, but way back in the ancient times, they would always have this concept of what they called the one. Consciousness is that one, it's the whole that everything is included within and that everything constitutes.
Yeah, 100%. And like, especially from, I'm thinking like in my personal experience going back like 3 or 4 years, I was like super atheistic, super
Mm,
materialist, and like I'm starting to like try to, I'm not like purposeful, I'm starting to grow out
mm,
of that as I start to understand newer and more complex, more high, different perspectives basically. And it's like
yeah.
one thing that was really challenging for me and probably a lot of people listening is like, all right, framing like it's so everyone wants to frame, myself included. I wanted to frame this in like the terms, in terms of science. So I'm like, oh, does that
Mm,
mean like what is consciousness and matter? Like, oh, so consciousness is just like matter because that's matter is what everything is made up of. And it's like,
mhm.
it's like consciousness is it's in its own category, right? So it's like we can't even like say like it's within science. And like I think this is a topic we should dive into later too. It's like materialism. So like materialism wants to put everything into the box of like, all right, this is matter. Anything that's outside of matter, that can't exist, because by its very nature, if we're saying that the universe is made up of matter and of objects, then anything that's not that is not real. And that's just kind of saying, oh, we already know what's real and what's not. And it's like, well, what happens when something is outside of matter or it's separate from it? There's no way to explain it within the scientific paradigm or the scientific uh, lingo, like within the words that we use to communicate in science. So it's like, how can we get over that perspective of like, all right, trying to frame consciousness in terms of science and in terms of the modern Western interpretation of the world, and how can we get past that and see it for what it really is, as like the experiencer of whatever you want to explain it as, awareness.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily equate science with materialism. I'll get to why in a minute. But first, I'll focus on how consciousness relates to materialism. So, from the materialist perspective, consciousness is something within matter that's generated by matter. So, it's like, for example, generated by the neurons in your brain. Uh, but really, it's the other way around. Matter is within consciousness and is generated by consciousness. Matter is actually made up of consciousness. Um, Something that I like to say a lot is matter is just a denser form of energy, and energy is just a denser form of consciousness. So, by the transitive property, matter is just a denser form of consciousness. It's still made up of consciousness. Uh, so a lot of spiritual teachers will just straight up deny the reality of matter, like this wall right here isn't really made of matter. I don't necessarily say that. I say, well, yeah, the wall is made of matter, but that matter is consciousness. So in kind of a transitive sense, you could say like the wall is made of consciousness as well, since the matter itself is. So I think that's what needs to shift. In the materialist perspective, they need to kind of flip everything inside out. It's not consciousness that's inside of matter, it's matter that's inside of consciousness. But as for science, I don't equate that with materialism. I just think that materialism is the belief system that's been derived out of the current state of science. So, for example, like in the future, scientists might find radically new discoveries that no longer support materialism. So, science is something that's independent of materialism. Back in medieval times, science supported the ethereal, the spiritual, the existence of God. Those were the belief systems derived from science back then. Now, in this day and age, as science makes more discoveries based on the nature of matter, materialism is the new belief system that's derived from science. But in the future, it's going to be something else. So as science changes, the belief systems that are derived from it are also going to change. So for me, what science is, it's not like an atheistic view of reality. It's not a materialistic view of reality. Science is not actually a view of reality. It's a method. Science is a method that you use to discover and self-validate ideas for yourself. So, for example, Leo Gura from actualize.org, he's a fairly close friend of mine that I talk to every once in a while. He thinks that science is just taking a little piece of matter and putting it in a test tube and like measuring it numerically. But what I kind of tell him is, well, Leo, when you take psychedelics and you directly experience the nature of reality for yourself, Leo, that itself is a form of science. You're using the scientific method by, through self-discovery, by discovering the nature of reality for yourself. So psychedelics, consciousness work, meditation, those might one day be science. Those might be the new methods of self-discovery. So I know a lot of gurus will say that science needs to disappear. It's outdated. I don't think science needs to disappear. It's just going to evolve and find better methods of self-discovery, because that's all science is. It's self-discovery.
So yeah, I guess we could. I've seen a lot of new people up and coming talk about like what science really is, and like talk about a lot of these anti-materialist ideas as like, all right, this still is science. It's just a switch, and it's like I feel like most people, we grow up in this materialist culture. I remember in high school learning the different ideas of science was taught like as
Mm,
indivisible from materialism. So it's
mm,
like, so you're saying that like if we define science as like the pursuit of truth right now, everyone in the scientific, just about not everyone, everyone in the vast majority of people in the scientific community, they go about science in a way of like, all right, we need to study external objects, and it's all about like
yeah,
making everything objective, and it's going under the, they're viewing it through the lens of science, through the lens of materialism. So like, oh, because I have the assumption that everything is made of matter, therefore we should only study this thing that we call matter, or this thing that we call quarks and atoms, and like these are something outside of myself. And like the vast majority of scientists are like, all right, in neuroscience we're going to understand what consciousness is because it's just something that's made out of matter. It's just something
yeah,
that we can understand through the processes in the brain. And it's, and you're saying like, all right, this is what, that's not really what science is. This is just one paradigm through which we have developed through science. But once we
yeah,
shed that paradigm of materialism, that's still going to be science, but it's not going to be in the same form that any of us know it today. It's going to be like
yeah.
would you equate it to with like science today is studying external stuff? In the future, maybe we'll understand that truth is better found when understanding experience, and it's like we might start to merge the study of like everything, all the objects in our experience with actual experience itself, and kind of develop more holistic ways of viewing what's actually
Mm.
true and what's not.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much summarizes it. It's kind of like another way to think about it is, if science, like you said, it's the pursuit of truth, or as I said, it's like a method of self-discovery. Uh, just because you're pursuing truth doesn't always mean that you're going to pursue it perfectly. You know, you can always make mistakes. So science hasn't fully developed. It hasn't perfected the art of pursuing the truth. There's a scale to this. There's shades of gray. It's not, the pursuit of truth is not black and white. It's not either you don't pursue it and you don't know it, or you pursue it and boom, you know it. No, there's a scale to this. There's a scope. You work up to truth. There's different degrees with which you understand it. And materialism is the worldview that's been birthed out of where science is at currently, the level of understanding that it has towards truth and towards reality currently. But that pursuit of truth is going to continue to climb through higher and higher levels. And as they climb through those higher levels, they're going to discover more about the nature of reality. And so eventually they're going to discover stuff that doesn't fit within the framework of materialism. And so now you're going to have new perspectives that are birthed out of that. So materialism is just the current perspective being birthed out of where science is at currently, but science will continue to grow.
So if I was at like if I was like at the precipice of like between the scientific materialist paradigm, and then I'm like almost into a new, like I'm starting to grow out of it, I'm like, all right, there's certain limitations that I'm seeing here, there's certain things, it's like, how should I go about doing real science if like I understand that there's flaws in this paradigm, but everyone within this group is like pulling me back down and saying, oh no, materialism is right, this is what the truth is. And it's like everyone, it's so easy, it's like it's going against the grain, and it's like swimming upstream because like you can't, like maybe you see certain flaws in it, but like what are the next steps there between getting pulled back down by everyone in the scientific community telling you that materialism is right, and like, all right, should I just pursue different ideas and make sure, like, really practice being open to new perspectives that are still maybe science, but they're not what the scientific community deems as right? Or like, how would you frame that and go about that?
So scientists are always going to pursue the next perspective based on evidence, just because that's how they go about self-discovery. You find more evidence through self-validation. So they're just going to need to present compelling enough evidence for the materialist to not pull them back down. Because if they present compelling enough evidence for something about the nature of reality that doesn't fit within the materialist paradigm, if that evidence is truly consistent and compelling enough, then all these other scientists should evolve their mindsets. If they don't, then they're not very good scientists. A good scientist does not get attached to a worldview. Some of them do, of course. I mean, scientists aren't perfect. They can definitely get attached to worldviews, but if they're very good at their jobs, they're not going to stick to the materialist worldview in the face of super compelling evidence. I know a lot of spiritual people think that scientists are stubborn, that they just don't want to let go of materialism. But it's not that they don't want to let go of it. It's not that they're attached to it. It's that there's not enough evidence yet for something else. I actually have talked to physics professors here at my university. If you actually sit down and have a conversation with a physics professor or any type of person who studies science for a living, you see that they are very open-minded people. I've had smoother, more open-minded conversations with scientists than a lot of people who do spiritual work. That's very hard to believe, but they are very open-minded people. So it's not that they're clinging to materialism or that they're clinging to their worldview. They're too open-minded for that. There's just not enough evidence yet for them to move on to something else. Once there's enough evidence, they'll move on.
Yeah. So I guess it's really easy to frame, to kind of put scientific materialism on this, like, just like to attack it in general, and to make just like, oh, scientific materialism is bad, everyone that believes it is stupid, like I'm
Mhm.
above that. And it's like, no, not necessarily. Like there's a lot of cool ideas from like Thomas Kuhn. Have you ever heard of
Mhm.
him? Just like,
I've heard of them, but I haven't looked at any of his content.
so I think he was like a philosopher and like a scientist in like the 1960s
Mm,
or 70s, 80s, sometime in the late 20th century. But he wrote on the philosophy of science. That's what it was. So
mhm,
he studied how science evolved and changed over time, right? So
yeah,
he's got like a really popular book called Structures of Scientific Revolutions, and it's
mhm,
like, he's the one that coined the term paradigm, like
mhm,
the scientific, like the materialist paradigm, or it's like, but
yeah,
basically what he said, a lot of stuff you were talking about really reminded me of a lot of the ideas that he talked about, because it's like,
mm,
he says science isn't linear. Science doesn't work by like iterating on certain discoveries, like whatever we view as science today, where we're like, all right, we know that like the basic ideas with science today, it's like these people may be super open-minded, but like the vast majority of people that have been in the scientific establishment long enough have become indoctrinated into the ideas of materialism. And so
mm,
it's like, all right, we're going from the assumption of materialism. How can we iterate and find something that doesn't go outside of materialism, but that makes new discoveries within the material world? And it's like,
mm,
he says that most discoveries, so like that idea that we aren't, that the sun is the center of the or the universe rather than the earth,
mhm,
then not even the sun, that's just one galaxy, which is, or
mhm,
one solar system, which is part of a et cetera, et cetera. It's like all, or like Newton's idea of gravity, Einstein's idea of general relativity. These were all paradigm shifts, is what he calls them.
mhm,
So it's like,
yeah,
instead of going in a linear fashion, it goes in like a stair step kind of
mhm, yeah,
fashion. And so like, and when you were talking about like scientists are open-minded, they just don't have enough evidence. It's like, on the contrary, like Kuhn says a lot that like a lot of scientists, after basically what the college institutional system is like, it's training you into this certain paradigm way of
Mhm.
viewing the world, right?
Yeah.
And so like most people that are older are never going to switch their point of view, even if there's ample evidence,
Mm.
ample like there's everything that rationally says that I should switch my paradigm. That still is just 30 years of being in the establishment and investing your emotions into a certain belief system. You're never going to change it. So he says like a lot of the new paradigms come when new people provide new evidence, and then all the
Mhm.
old people die out and all the new people are more open to these new ideas and this new evidence, and then that's when it
Yeah.
becomes the accepted paradigm. So I'd
Mhm.
say, in like when you said like, oh, scientists are actually really open, it's like, yeah, like some people are open, some people aren't. It's like just
Mhm.
because someone's a scientist or just because someone's spiritual is not going to determine how open they are. That's like a completely
Mhm.
separate factor. Like those things are
Yeah, exactly.
completely not overlapping at all. It's just like
Mhm.
some scientists are not open, some scientists are, some spiritual people are not
Mhm.
open at all, some are. It's kind of like, I think just
Mhm.
making that distinction that those are separate is valuable too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely, because of course you can have, like you were saying, open-minded and closed-minded spiritual people, open-minded and closed-minded scientists, but with that, you almost have to balance what Kuhn says with what I say. So, yes, it is possible that as scientists, continue to study under one perspective or one paradigm throughout their lives, that they will become so comfortable with it that it'll become more difficult for them to break out of that paradigm. But I wouldn't necessarily go with Kuhn in the sense of saying that it's impossible for them to break out of that paradigm. I would just say it's more difficult. Like as you become more comfortable with something, the more difficult it becomes to break out of that comfort zone. So I'm sure that no matter how indoctrinated somebody is into a perspective, there's always some amount of evidence powerful enough to compel them out of it. It's just a matter of how powerful does that evidence have to be. Like, for example, let's like not use a scientist as an example. Let's just look at a Christian. What would it take to convince a Christian that Shiva exists? Let's say like Shiva could just appear to that person like even more physically than the room they're in. Like Shiva is more physical and more real than everything else in their room. I'm sure an experience that powerful would convince even a Christian that Shiva does exist, but look at how powerful the experience has to be. And those types of experiences do exist. So the evidence does exist. It's just it has to be above a certain bar. Everybody, what I like to say is that everybody has a different standard of evidence. Some people have their bars set lower and they're easier to convince. You don't need as much evidence to convince them. Some people have their bars set higher. They're more skeptical. You need far more evidence to convince them. But nobody has their bar set all the way up. There's really no top. So if nobody has their bar set all the way up, there's always some higher point above their bar, above their standard of evidence, no matter how high they set it. So what that means is that everybody can be convinced of something because there's always evidence sitting above their bar. Nobody's bar goes all the way up. So it's not impossible to convince somebody, um, even if they are very indoctrinated into a worldview, like going back to the scientists who have been studying under the materialist perspective their whole life, even if they are so comfortable with that worldview that their bar kind of keeps raising as they become more comfortable with it, the bar is never going to reach a top. That bar will get higher and higher, but there's always going to be a point above it where if you present powerful enough evidence, it will jump over that bar and convince them.
Yeah.
So
I would agree. I think it's better to look at it as like a scale. So it's like, yeah, as you go more, it becomes harder and harder. And it's like for
Mhm.
some people, they're in the middle where it's like it's not easy to convince them, but it's not impossible. It's not
Mhm.
hard either. Like
Yeah.
if I think especially too, like it depends how many people are adopting it too. So if like 10
Mhm.
people are in this belief system and they're trying to convince you, you're like, all right, well, I have millions of people behind me that are supporting me behind scientific materialism. You have 10 people
Mhm.
that are saying these ideas. Like that's not like maybe if you provided me enough evidence, I might switch. And then over time, say like 100, 1,000, a million people switch. It's like, all right, once you get enough people into this new paradigm, then it'll probably become easier to make everyone in the other paradigm switch. And I think
Mhm.
Kuhn's idea too was that like not that it was impossible for people to switch. I guess I worded that wrong, but it's like
Mhm.
once someone has been in it long enough, their bar,
Mhm.
like you would say, is so high that they will never switch before they die. It's like,
Yeah, so what you're saying is that the evidence is never gonna be presented to them,
yeah.
basically.
So like
Yeah,
all
yeah, that makes sense 'cause,
yeah,
um, yeah, because eventually you could say it reaches, like, a critical point to where the evidence it would take to convince them is so massive that it's never gonna be something that's realistically presented to them in their lifetime, and so they'll die unconvinced, having never received that evidence.
exactly.
Mm,
And so I think for a lot of people, it's like there is not enough evidence against scientific materialism. And so like especially when I was going, it was really hard. I still am like very I was so entrenched in it growing up because the first 18, 17 years of my life, I don't know however many years I spent in school was all indoctrinating myself into the scientific materialist paradigm just because that's what's
mhm,
normal. And it's like there's nothing wrong with that.
yeah,
It's just
mhm,
the way that things are right now. And then taking like 3 or so years recently to really immerse myself into different perspectives, it's like I'm still holding on to these materialist paradigms just because they're
mhm,
so common in our culture and because like
yeah,
it's hard to break out of them, So it's like,
mhm,
what would you say is like the most important, like what's the most important thing to like be able to break out of these things when new evidence does arise? So not saying that there is evidence and like, oh, let's switch right now, but like I would
mhm,
like for me, it's just like trying to understand what does it mean to be open-minded and what does it mean to actually like practice the ability of like, all right, I'm now able to take more perspectives. Like I'm able to fought like over time get better at seeing things from a different point of view. Even if I'm not going to end up believing in them, I still am able to open myself up enough to be able to like actually say that I tried my absolute best to see the world from this person's point of view, like
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to kind of what I was talking about, this different standards of evidence. Seeing the world from different people's perspectives, and you could say like looking at different forms of evidence from their perspectives, you kind of have to look at it from their standard of evidence also, because that's a part of their perspective. So let's take a Christian for example again. If something is written in the Bible, that itself is typically above the standard of evidence for a Christian. In other words, if something is written in the Bible, that will be powerful enough evidence to convince them. But then, if you present a Christian with a scientific finding that's published in like Science Today or something like
Yeah.
that, those findings are going to be below their bar, their standard of evidence, and so that's not going to convince them. But then you look from a scientist perspective, those two are going to be flip flopped. It's going to be the other way around. If something being written in the Bible is going to be below their standard of evidence and not convince them, while a journal of published findings is going to be above their bar of evidence. So that's kind of something you need to keep in mind when studying the world from these different perspectives and understanding why different people are convinced of different things. It's not only because they have these different standards of evidence, but it's also because different forms of evidence are going to be above or below their bars based on their perspective.
Yeah, and I think another key distinction to make too is that I think that's really important to like be able to see that people have different measures for what they consider true. And like a lot of Christians, when you said that, I was gonna like jump in and you literally said what I was about to say was like people in that believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, that's the highest form of evidence. So like any other form of evidence that we would deem as like indisputably true, they'd be like, oh, that's not literally in the Bible, so I'm not going to believe it.
Yeah.
But I think another key distinction is that but we can't group people that are like Christian into that group of literal interpretation of the Bible. So it's like there's many different, like a religion, like I think I read that about like I want to say 60 to 80% of people are in this literal Ken Wilber calls it mythic literal. So it's like they take the viewpoint of the literal interpretation of whatever doctrine it can be for any religion, right? But there's also higher stages like the rational, which we would deem scientific. There's a lot of Christians that see the world in a rational way, and they see that scientific evidence is the highest form of belief that can also be Christian. So it's like I think it makes it even more complex because it's like, all right, well, this guy's a Christian, so he believes in his highest form of evidence is the literal interpretation. It's like, all right, like a lot of Christians do, but like there are also some Christians that take a rational, a pluralistic, and integral stage, like they're stage yellow Christians that see the world that like it's just exactly. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, definitely different standards of evidence within certain groups as well. Not every Christian is going to have the same standards. Not every Hindu is going to have the same standards. Even atheists, not every atheist is going to have the same standards of either. So yeah, that's definitely something important to keep in mind. What you said also, that it's not going to be consistent throughout the entire group. People are going to take different perspectives more seriously or less seriously than people within their own groups even.
So I guess in that case, it would be almost like an individual basis. So it's like not trying to categorize by group, but like by individual, where it's like, all right, you kind of feel out like, all right, how is this person like when they say like, this is what I believe and here's the evidence for it. It's like, all right, well, what evidence are they putting forth? It doesn't matter what they believe in. It just matters like, all right, like you kind of get a feel individually for like what they believe in. And then we could use that standard to understand their perspective more, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so this kind of brings me into another point of like, all right, if we're trying to like understand these other perspectives more and we're trying to put ourselves in their shoes, do you have a good video on like what does an intelligent discussion actually entail, and like what are the dynamics of intelligent conversations and what's the word, not intelligent, but like what is a part of like a valuable conversation with someone where instead of just hearing their point and not really listening but waiting to speak to explain your belief system. And it's just like I see this a lot, and like this is kind of like I've kind of shied away from watching any type of content on these topics because you see like atheism versus religion, or like Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson, whatever. It's like when I listen to those, all I hear is one person has one belief system, the other person has another, and none of them are willing to even listen to the other person before they speak and just explain their belief system. So like, what does a real discussion look like in your eyes?
Yeah, so I actually do have a video on my channel. I believe it's titled How to Have an Intelligent Discussion. It's pretty lengthy. I believe I made it about 25 minutes, if I remember correctly, because there are a lot of nuances within the art of having an intelligent discussion, because it really is an art. It's a lot of things you have to remember as you're letting the other person speak, a lot of different things you have to keep in mind as you're speaking to them and presenting your proof or your evidence. And so what I went to in that video, I talked a lot about the standards of evidence that we just talked about. That was really like the main part of the video. You have to remember the other side's standard of evidence. You have to remember their perspective, what it would take to convince them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that convincing somebody is the most important thing in an intelligent discussion. The most important thing is to see where they're coming from. Why are they not convinced of what you're saying? What would you have to do to convince them of what you're saying? Why are you not convinced of what they're saying? What would they have to show you before you would start to be convinced of what they're saying? These are all things that you have to keep in mind as you're discussing with the other person. And something I talk about in the video too is that you have to represent their viewpoint accurately, because otherwise the discussion is just going to go off the rails. You're going to be misrepresenting them, and you're essentially going to be arguing against a paper mache that's not really there. You're not actually arguing against the person's perspective. You're arguing against what you think their perspective is, and so you're not actually having a real debate with that real person. So you have to know what their perspective is accurately, and sometimes what that takes is repeating back to them what you think they've just said. And if you don't get it right, you revise it, and you keep revising it until they're satisfied, until they say, yeah, that's what I was saying. You got it that time. Once you get it right, once you state their perspective back to them to their satisfaction, then you make your objection. Then you say, okay, I see what you're saying here, but this is why I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I like that. And like, I think it's important to notice too that the process of stating it back to them where they agree with it, that can be a really lengthy process. And that's not
Yeah.
an easy thing to do whatsoever.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, that's why a lot of people don't do it, unfortunately, is because it takes so much time. But my discussions have become infinitely better when I do that. Like I said, it's the difference between having a false discussion versus a true discussion. You're not actually discussing with the person if you're not discussing their actual perspective. So it's worth it to take the extra time to really make sure you're representing their perspective correctly, because you want them to do the same with you also.
Yeah, definitely. I can't remember where I heard that from. I think it was either some uh like postmodern philosopher, or it was either that or some Greek philosopher. I think it might have been like some Greek philosopher. I can't remember the name, but basically he said like in order like I think I was studying epistemology, and like one of the
Mm,
ideas in epistemology is that like all arguments are false unless like because everyone has whatever someone uses as a term for like, all right, this is like a stupid example, but like a computer, like what someone
mm,
sees as a computer is different from what another person sees. Or like say you
yeah,
say like morality, good and bad, what one person sees as morality is could be completely different from what someone
yeah,
else sees as morality. So like that the hardest process in a conversation is one of the philosophers I read like actually had a term for it where you like get on the same page on like what the semantics are. What are you determining as, because
mm,
language is just an arrow, right? A language
yeah,
is just like when I say like I am going for a walk, it's like the walk is just an arrow to like a different action that I'm performing in real life. And it's like
mm,
the most important thing is making sure that your arrows are pointing toward the same thing in your guys' perception in reality, rather than you're arguing about some concept that's pointing towards separate things in your guys' mind, right?
yeah,
And I've noticed this a lot because like I've tried to have recently some conversations with like we were saying, like the mythic literal, like people that have literal interpretations of the Bible. I'm like, all right, I
mm,
want to actually understand their perspective and like
mm,
what makes them on like hold the Bible as the highest standard of knowledge. And it's like
yeah,
they think they can convince me, I think I can convince them, and nothing
mm,
happens. They're like,
yeah,
all right, so you believe this, and I'm like, no, not you're like I'll say something that involves like I try to explain my belief system to them, and they're like, oh, so you believe this is why what you believe is wrong. I'm like, well, that's not really what I believe. You kind of summed it up in a way that doesn't really fit what I actually believe. And then you're arguing
Yeah.
against whatever you summed up. And
Yeah.
that's kind of when I started to understand that this process is not an easy one. Like
Hmm.
through like 2 or 3 iterations, we still weren't even close to what
Yeah.
I actually believed. And it would take me like hours and hours to actually like go forward. So like, I think my question to you, like, what you said you've had some of these intelligent discussions where you actually have sat down with someone and kind of got as close as you can to the bottom of what they actually believe and then
Yeah.
going from there. Like what were the topics or like what give me some examples so I can kind of frame it better.
So, I mean, I've discussed with various groups of people, Mormons, Buddhists, Hindus, physicists, philosophers, and so the topics can vary a lot, but typically what I would discuss with them is like the nature of reality, the nature of God, the nature of infinity, and I never really had like any problems in these discussions when talking about something like the nature of infinity, because that's all kind of like everybody accepts mathematics pretty well.
Yeah.
It's when it comes to stuff like the nature of God that you start to notice a lot of the relativity.
And
So,
everyone
like the
has a
Mormons, yeah,
different view of
exactly.
God.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where remembering the nuances of how to have an intelligent discussion, that's where those would come in handy the most. Because I would have to look at how they define God first. So for the Mormons, God is this anthropomorphic being who is separate from creation and wants everybody to find him, has this personal will. He's structured the nature of time and existence with a very personal plan in mind. And so when you're talking to them about what God is like, you have to talk to them about their conception of God. You can't talk about it like, oh, well, God is reality itself, because that's not the God they're talking about. They're talking about this completely different type of being. Uh, Whereas when I talk to like Buddhists, um, they either don't believe in any type of God, or they kind of have that view that God is reality itself. God is just the ultimate reality. He's not this personal being. It's just the whole set of everything, kind of like what we were saying about consciousness earlier. If there's one thing that could be called God, it's that. So if you're having a discussion about God, where God is reality itself or God is consciousness itself, the discussion is going to be completely different than if you're talking about an anthropomorphic being who's personally structured everything we experience here on Earth. So you essentially start talking about different things. So having a discussion about God with a Mormon is actually not having the same discussion as when you're discussing God with a Buddhist. You're not talking about God in each one, you're talking about different things that each one calls God. They put this label God on different things. So even though you're having discussions about God, you're having discussions about two different things that have just been labeled similarly.
Yeah, I think that's really important too cuz like I think when I talk to like I used to be really involved in Buddhism, right? So everyone's like, "Oh, you're a Buddhist." I'm like, I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist, but like this is like the stuff I'm diving into the most. Or like, all right, what's the
Mhm,
Buddhist view on God? And I'm like
mhm,
trying to explain it.
mhm.
And you can't explain the Buddhist view of God to a Christian because their view of God, they have that view and they're like, all right, this is what God is. They're like, oh, so
Yeah,
that's not God. And so like I'll talk
yeah,
to like a
mhm,
Christian and they'll be like, oh, so what you determine as God, that's just the universe. I'm like,
exactly.
then
Yeah,
then they say something about the nature of the universe, and they're like, "Well, my God is outside the universe," and I'm like, "Well, then whatever you call this universe, that's not the Buddhist view of God because that's just whatever you're trying to conceptualize as the Buddhist view of God.
yeah,
The Buddhist view of God is everything, whatever is encompassed in the universe and beyond it. That is like the Buddhist view of God and of
mm,
the all encompassing of the oneness of everything. It's whatever. It's like I think that's a really key distinction that a lot of people don't make.
mhm,
And I think, yeah, just it's really valuable to understand that, like, are having a conversation, the words don't really matter. It's about what they point to. And when you can understand that, like, I think it's a key skill to like, what are your thoughts on this? Like, I feel like it's a skill that can be developed to
Mm.
understand when someone's arguing about a concept and you're like, all right, are they like that? They're actually arguing about different things. Like being able to see that could be like a skill that could be developed too.
Yeah, it's definitely a skill that can be developed. You just have to be able to look at the attributes behind the label that you're using. So, like, okay, this Christian keeps talking about God. You have to ask them to define God for you. And then if there's a Buddhist in the conversation and they're talking about God, ask them, define God for me. And you'll see that even though they're using the same labels, based on the list of attributes that they each define for you, they have two different lists. And so the lists are labeled the same, but they're two different lists. And so they're talking about two different things. And so that's kind of what it takes as a skill. You just have to be able to look behind the curtain of the label, so to speak, and look at the list of attributes that's behind their use of that label rather than getting kind of gaslighted by the labels themselves.
Yeah. I think we're one last thing on this topic too is like a lot of times it can be a big like ego trip too because for a lot of people, myself included, back like when I had the atheist perspective, it was like, all right, if you try to challenge their view of God, like if you try to like people have such an attachment to certain ideas that if you try to like explain that another person's idea of, how do I want to say this? Like if someone develops such an attachment to the idea of God, a personal God, a Christian God, you can't
Mm,
really have an intelligent discussion with that person because they're going to become so defensive whenever you use the term God in place of
mm,
whatever other entity that you call, or whatever other thing that you call God. It's like,
mm,
I think a lot of times it's like understanding that, like, all right, I can't even use this word because there's so much
mm.
emotional attachment to it within this person that I have to
Yeah.
say, like, and then it is kind of just becomes like a mess because then like they're like, all right, well, what do you actually believe about God? It's like, all right, this is what I believe, this is what I
Mm,
call God, but it's not what it's like different than yours. And some people just can't wrap their head around that, you know?
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's kind of the thing is sometimes when you have discussions like that, you almost have to use the labels that satisfy them, which can be a pain, but it's like, so if you're saying that God is equal to reality and they don't like that, they don't think that's God because what you're calling God is just reality, well, then you almost have to like substitute the word reality in for God uh, so that your label doesn't put them off or make them so defensive. But of course, that's a personal choice. Some people prefer to be more crude and just use the label, even if it makes them angry. I tend to be a little bit more reserved and just use whatever label satisfies them. Or sometimes I'm a little bit more neutral. I'll use whatever label I like, but then tell them, okay, but remember, when I use this label, I'm referring to something that you would label as this. And so I kind of help them see like the relativity of it, that I'm talking about this, but what I'm talking about is what you would call that. And that can be helpful too. That's a way to have like a flexible conversation and help them to see your side of it more, and like why you're using the terms you're using and what exactly you're talking about and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it's an art. It's not
Yeah.
easy to do. It just takes practice.
Mhm.
The more that you try to explain, I found that recently too. The more that I practice, like the practice I'm getting is the more I try to explain my ideas, the more I realize that I don't have a really solid framework for what I do believe, and so it's hard
Mhm.
to explain what I believe if I'm not even like, I don't have any set belief system. I'm just like, this is how I feel, and it's
Mhm.
hard to conceptualize it. But the more I do, the more I realize, all right, people, I can't use. I mean, I guess for me, I can use whatever terms I want, but for other people, it's like most people have a. there's certain terms that have a lot of emotional attachment that I almost just avoid them at all. Like, but yeah, it's definitely an art. It's not easy to do.
Exactly, for sure. Yeah.
And so I think we can start wrapping this up. I guess one last topic that I was kind of interested in is like, how do you have any process for how you like go about questioning deep topics and really like having that, like not questioning like on a conceptual level, but questioning on like an experiential level, if that makes sense? So it's kind of like recently I've been trying a lot to like, all right, what questions can I ask myself to like it's been who am I a lot, but like a lot of that's like there's a lot of questions I'm like, all right, what questions in like epistemology or like metaphysics can I like get into that are like that can help me understand, not like I think the first question that comes to mind is like why do I trust everyone that I trust in regards to what I know, and like why should I trust a scientist over like some spiritual guru that's telling me what the truth is? And then vice versa. Like, why should I trust anyone in regard to the
Yeah.
knowledge that I attribute into my belief system? And it's like,
Mhm.
all right, if that's the truth, then like, what do I know and how do I actually go about truth? Like, what are some like questions you ask, or like, how do you approach like trying to go deeper into your experience and trying to ask these questions, and like how do you
Mhm.
find the questions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so basically what you have to do is almost like keep undermining yourself, like keep digging deeper and deeper. And when you think you found a foundation, you have to assume there's still something underneath that and keep digging and digging and digging. So, like a quick example is uh, how do we know whether or not the universe is finite? A lot of people think that the universe has an end and then there's just nothing on the other side. Well, how do we know that? What if there is this like border, but then there's still more on the other side of that border? And so you start questioning, okay, what if reality is infinite? What if it's endless? But then you think to yourself, okay, but it couldn't be anything more than endless because that would be logically impossible. Logically, there's nothing further than infinity. There's nothing beyond what goes on forever because that's a logical impossibility. But then you have to actually see, you think you found a foundation, but then you have to undermine that. Okay, well, who put that logic in place? Why is it logical that infinity is the end all be all? What if there is stuff outside of logic? What if there is contradictory stuff beyond the endless, literally beyond something that can't be moved beyond? And so you almost start to undermine your own rationality at that point. And, I use this example of the size of the universe, but you can do it with any example. You can keep undermining, and you think you found this logical foundation. You can still keep digging further and further and further. Um, and it does get kind of bottomless in a sense because you could always just keep digging. So the question that a lot of people would have is, well, where do I stop? If I could just keep undermining myself forever and ever and ever and going further with it, how do I know when to stop? Well, you kind of have to look at it based on, you could say, like the utility of what you find. Like, is it practical for you to view the universe as finite, or is it more practical for you to view it as infinite? Whenever you find like a worldview that's practical to you and really helps you in life, then you could say, okay, that one's serving you. Don't undermine that. Don't fix something that doesn't need to be fixed. So if you can just keep going forever and ever and ever, uh, and never reach a bottom, you could just stop at whatever serves you. Because if it stops serving you, if that worldview doesn't serve you anymore, you could always just undermine it again and keep digging until you find another one that serves you better. And that's really what life's about. If you think about it, you're always looking at these various perspectives that could help you in life, and you adopt one until it stops serving you, then you adopt another one. And so living life is really just shifting from frame to frame
Yes.
on whatever is healthiest at the moment.
And then like Yeah, so like throughout life, we develop different frames, different
Mm,
perspectives. Sometimes we get stuck in perspectives and we don't want to give them up. We hold them as
mhm,
dear to us. Sometimes we are able to give them up. I
mhm,
think there's a difference. Like, how would you say if we're going after like I think it's a certain characteristic. Like some people are focused on like, all right, what is true? And like I want to understand what the truth is no matter what it turns out to
mhm,
be. And then I feel like that's a little bit different than like the utilitarian
yeah,
like whatever's most practical, that's gonna help serve me. That's kind of like, all right, what's the purpose of my belief system? Is it to like, all right, help me the best in the world, or is it to get at like what is true? And like you can have
mhm,
different, like you can approach it in different ways, right? So it's like
yeah,
what
mhm,
what does it look like to actually focus on like truth and to be like, because like, all right,
yeah,
I think that would be cool to like, all right, I don't want to have a false belief system. Like I want to know what is actually true. Even
mhm,
like I have certain belief systems that or perspectives that work for me right now and that are very utilitarian. They
mhm,
help me a lot.
mhm,
But like let's say I want to get at like truth. And that's right now in my head, that's really abstract. Like, all right, I have no clue what truth, like what it's just like super abstract that I don't even know where to start.
mhm,
So like
yeah,
and it sounds like you think about these topics a lot of like infinity and like the to me this is what I attribute to like trying to go after truth is like
mhm,
questioning in this sort of way, kind of like how what you explain in your videos. That's like, all right, this is like from what I understand, this is the best way I found to like go after truth is just say like, all right, start from a blank slate. I'm not gonna say that one person's ideas are more valuable than any other person's. All right, where do I
mhm,
go from here? What could be true? What could not be? And like, I guess like what helps you arrive at like the stuff you talk about in your videos at like about infinity? Like, where do you get these ideas from? And like,
mhm,
how do you like think about this type of stuff?
yeah. So, I mean, I get all the content on my channel directly from experience. I don't talk about it and say with confidence that it's real unless I directly experience it. But then, as to the relationship between truth and utility, this is a common idea that the two are separate, that what works the best, or in other words, what has the most utility, is not always going to be the most truthful. But I actually think that truth and utility are inseparable. Something that's more true is inherently going to work better and have more utility because it literally represents reality better. Think about it. That's what it means to be more true. If something is more true, it literally represents the nature of reality better. Therefore, it works with the nature of reality better. Therefore, it's going to work better and have more utility. So, the pursuit of truth doesn't necessarily mean you throw out utility and don't focus on what works best. Let's just blindly go after truth, because if you focus on the utility, you will actually be focusing on truth. If you find what works best, you will actually be finding what's more true. Because I mean, think if, like, let's say you kept pursuing truth and eventually one day you came across the ultimate truth, like this is the broadest, all encompassing truth. It still doesn't end there, because now you have to ask who or what put this truth in place. Why is this the ultimate truth? Who or what makes truth true? So you see, at that point, you jump beyond pure truth and go into utility, because whatever entity, who or what made that truth true, would have chosen so based on some utilitarian reason. So that truth is there out of some utility. So even once you arrive at an ultimate truth or an objective truth, it's still there based on utility. So that utility is still inseparable from truth itself.
So I think I like we said earlier, I was defining utility in a probably a different way than you were using it. So like
Yeah.
utility for me is like how do I live a good life and like what
Mhm.
helps me serve like almost like a survival thing, like what helps me
Yeah.
be
And
most effective in the world. And for you,
yeah,
it's like
it actually, so it is what you just said. It is what serves you best. The only difference is that I identify that with truth. I say that truth is inseparable from that utility that you just stated. Truth is what works best. Truth is what serves you the most, if that makes sense. So I don't think our definitions differ that much. I think it's just um, you're making a dichotomy where I'm not making one.
Yeah. So the truth would be like, say, in my own experience, it would be the
Mm.
most true thing in my experience is whatever is also
Working the best for you in your experience.
working the best. Working the best, I guess, like for what? Like, what is it working the best for? Is what I kind of get like
So
stuck up on.
that's actually another conversation as well. Like you could ask, well, how do you know what works best? Some people will say it's what makes you happiest. Some people will say it's what helps you grow. So you almost have to define that for yourself. Like, what would you consider to be the best? Would you consider yourself to be better off if you were happier, or if you were growing more, or if you were serving other people more? You kind of have to define that for yourself first as to which of those paths is best. And then based on that, you then look at, okay, well, what viewpoint, what vantage point would help me be the best in that area? And that's what would work best for you in your life. And so that would provide the most meaning and the most truth for you in your current experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, so whatever would be most true would be whatever serves whatever you determine to be most valuable, the best. The only thing I got stuck up on is I've like read some ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about Donald Hoffman in one of your videos, and like he's got a lot of ideas about. He calls it
Mm-hmm.
like the fitness beats truth theorem, which is
Yeah.
the idea that like, but that almost goes that back to like an evolution. Like if that goes back to like evolution and like
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
Darwinian idea of like whatever is helps you survive the most, that's what's going to stay, whether that's genes or not. Like the gene side of thing is just one aspect of it, and that there's like
Mm-hmm.
some arguments against that too. It's just like, all right, in any system, whatever survives, like that's gonna be. It's basically like he's saying that the
So like,
things that help us survive are not the same as truth, and the things that
mm-hmm.
were able to be perpetuated to help us survive. That's why he kind of says the idea of like the a good analogy he uses like the computer screen versus like the computer, like the
Mm-hmm.
folder on the computer screen. He's like, on our computer screen we have like a blue folder. That's not like the truth of what that file actually is, but it hides the truth in a way to help us survive, to help us navigate the interface. We don't want to know what that folder is actually made of on our computer because it's bits of energy, then we could never accomplish anything. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like the same in our perception. Like whatever our perception is that we view as a material world, that's just like an interface. That's not like the actual truth of what's there. That's just what helps us survive is whatever interface that we're seeing right now of some other reality that's not, that we don't
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. So I mean, what that seems to do there is that kind of seems to separate out utility from truth, like what works the best, what has the most utility, as Donald Hoffman was talking about, and what I talked about in that video. It doesn't seem to be what's the most true. However, that's only in the sense of like the human body. So you have to look like a little bit broader. You have to look at your experience as a whole rather than just what serves the human body and human evolution the best. So maybe what serves the human body and human evolution the best is not the most true. But if you go broader and look at what serves your whole experience or the whole universe the best, that could be what's the most true. So I think the reason why what Donald Hoffman talks about seems to create this dichotomy between utility and truth is because it's not broad enough. It's only representing utility from the perspective of the human body and human evolution. You have to look at utility from a broader vantage point, and once you do, you'll see it start to merge with truth more. That's what I would think. And then the example he used, I really like that with the interface, but then you have the blue folder. to represent it. I mean, that also kind of gets into it like a little bit like relative to the human brain, representing it as a blue folder works best, but is that really the best representation once you start to consider a more holistic view, like from the vantage point of the universe itself, stuff like that. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what I would say to that question.
Yeah, no, I would. So, would you say like, what does a broader viewpoint look like? So it's like that's like the
Mm,
vantage point of like the human body, and but like we can only experience the world like, but like understanding what is like truth or like going at that from like, all right, the consciousness awareness experience standpoint is like kind of what I will kind of interpret that as, like a broader
mm,
viewpoint, meaning like, all right, maybe he's kind of conceptualizing it as like the human body evolved in this way to perceive in this way. Maybe that's not the truth of what's there. Like he even says like we should base truth not on materialism but on consciousness, and he like tries to make some
mm,
mathematical theorems about why consciousness is like the most fundamental thing. And like it
mm.
sounds pretty similar, but it's like not from the human body but from like experience and who we truly are, like kind of what we talked about at the beginning. Would you say that's like a broader, like what the
Yeah,
broader viewpoint looks like, or what does a broader viewpoint look like?
yeah. So I would say there's many degrees of broader viewpoints, but that is one example what we were talking about earlier, because kind of the view of consciousness or non-duality and taking the whole experience into account rather than just the human body, that's already a broader vantage point because it doesn't just include the human body, it also includes the surrounding environment. So that's how you know a broader viewpoint from a more contracted one. The broader viewpoint is going to include more and take more into account. So looking at the human brain is a more contracted viewpoint than looking at the human body as a whole, which is more contracted than looking at your entire experience as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. That it's just like degrees of how
Yeah,
far you go. Yeah.
exactly.
All right. That's all I have for now. I think that's a pretty good, it was about an hour and a half, I think.
Mhm.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast. I'm going to end it here. Where could the people listening find you? Like just the name of your YouTube channel, anywhere else that you want them to find you, or it's whatever.
Yeah, I've been very happy to be here. Very great talk. Thanks for having me. My YouTube channel is called Everything Explained by Ethan Kahn. Again, my last name is spelled Kahn. And I kind of named the channel that, like Everything Explained by Ethan Kahn, not so much as an identification with the ego, but as a of it, like, well, this is everything explained through the mouth of just one person. It's through the mouth of Ethan Kahn. So it's kind of a recognition of one ego, one perspective, and it's everything explained through that. So
Yeah, I like that.
go ahead and look me up there if you want to watch more of my content.
Sweet.